All right, welcome. Today, we're unlocking the political genius of the ancient Sri Lankan kingdom. We're going to explore the precise blueprint these kings used to build and maintain absolute power, not just for a little while, but for centuries. So it all kind of boils down to this one huge question. How do you convince an entire population that you're more than just, well, a person? That you are, in fact, a god on earth? I mean, that was the ultimate political challenge, right? And believe me, the ancient Sri Lankan kings were absolute masters at solving it. And today, we're going to find out exactly how they pulled it off. Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, what exactly does a king do? Then we'll get into how they built up this larger-than-life image. After that, we'll look at how they kept the crown in the family. And finally, we'll check out the whole system that kept the kingdom running smoothly.
All right, let's start with the absolute basics. What actually made someone a king? You know, you might think it was just about having the biggest army or the most treasure, but nope. In ancient Sri Lanka, kingship was more like a contract. Rulers had a very specific job description, and their very right to sit on that throne, it all depended on them actually doing their job.
So think of the king's power as a four-part deal with the people. First up, they had to grow the economy, and a huge part of that was building these massive irrigation systems. Second, they had to provide security, protect everyone from foreign threats. Third, they were expected to boost the people's spirituality. Think building incredible temples. And number four, and this is the big one, all of this was to win the trust of the people. This wasn't just, good policy. It was the absolute bedrock of their power. But here's the thing. Fulfilling your duties makes you a really good manager, right? But how does a king become this revered, almost supernatural figure? Well, this is where the real genius of their political strategy kicks in. It was all about royal branding. So let's dive into the powerful ideas they used to make themselves seem totally larger than life. Okay, so the most direct approach, it was a concept called Devatwa. This literally framed the king as a living god. No messing around. For instance, you had King Kutakana Abaya calling himself Nadeshwara, which literally means God for humans. And get this, King Mahasen, who was an absolute master at building irrigation tanks, was actually worshipped as the god of Maneri. Why? Because what he did for the economy was seen as a divine gift. Then there's this other fascinating idea called Parvataraja, or Mountain King. This concept linked the ruler directly to immense power, and importantly, wealth. The most famous example, of course, is King Kashyapa I. I mean, this guy built his legendary fortress on a giant rock and literally styled himself after Kuwera, the god of wealth. He was basically creating a real-life version of the god's mythical mountain home. How cool is that? But it wasn't always about projecting this raw, intimidating power. The concept of bodhisattva was a brilliant and kind of softer approach. This presented the king as a future Buddha. It was a masterful way to build a bond of trust. The message was super clear. Hey, my own spiritual destiny depends on me ruling you fairly and justly. What a powerful promise, right?
And then, for just pure, unshakable authority, you have the concept of Chakravarti. This is a Sanskrit term, and it basically means world dominator or universal ruler. So you had kings like Nishankamala proudly slapping titles like Kalinga Chakravarti onto their official inscriptions. It was a way of declaring to the whole world that their power was absolute and their kingdom was vast. No question.
So look, whether they were positioning themselves as a living god, a mountain king, or a future Buddha, the strategy was always the same. Each of these powerful brands served one single vital purpose: to show the king's absolute superiority and make their right to rule completely, totally unquestionable.
Okay, so projecting this incredible image of power is one thing, but making sure it stays in your family, that's a whole other challenge. And that brings us to the really crucial and, as you'll see, often messy, rules of royal succession. So, there were pretty much two main ways the crown could be passed down. The first was brother to brother. So the throne passes to the king's eldest younger brother. A classic example is King Sadatissa taking over from his very famous brother, King Dutagamunu. But the more frequent method was father to son. Power would go to the king's elder son, or specifically, the elder son of his main queen. Now that system sounds pretty clear on paper, doesn't it? But history is almost never that simple. The truth is, these rules were really fragile. And when that line of succession was broken, oh boy, the consequences could be absolutely devastating. We're talking intense conflict and bitter power struggles, often inside the royal family itself. And this brings us right back to that dramatic story of King Kashapa. He actually grabbed the throne from his own father. So why? Well, because he wasn't the legitimate heir. See, his mother was a second queen. The real heir was his half-brother Mughal, and that one single act of stealing the throne, it triggered a legendary conflict that really proves just how critical these rules were. Okay, so we've covered the king's image and how the crown was passed down. But how did one person actually run an entire kingdom day to day? Well, they couldn't do it alone, that's for sure. They had to rely on a really sophisticated and well-organized machine, the state administration. First off, let's just look at how the top job itself evolved. So, before power was completely centralized, the king was known as Mahapurumaka. That basically means the great chief among other chieftains, kind of like a first among equals. But as the state grew and power got consolidated, that title changed to Maharaja, or Great King. And that signaled one supreme ruler over the whole land. And this just reveals a stunning level of organization. This was no one-man show. The king had a full-on cabinet. I'm talking a chief minister, sure, but also super specialized roles, a treasurer to handle the money, a city architect, an officer in charge of coins, and even an officer for the archives. This was a sophisticated, almost modern-looking government. And make no mistake, this complex structure wasn't just for show. It wasn't just ceremonial. This was the engine that powered the entire kingdom. It's what provided stability, it's what allowed the king to manage everything from building projects to the economy, and ultimately, it's what delivered an effective government that actually benefited the people. So, let's step back for a second. We've seen the three key pillars, right? A divine brand to justify their role, a system for succession to keep it going, and a powerful administration to actually make it all happen. But what does it all build? What's the final result of this incredibly sophisticated political blueprint? Well, what it builds is a legacy of rule that lasted. The power of these kings wasn't just taken by force. No, it was a whole system, meticulously justified, highly organized, and carefully sustained for generations. And that combination, that's the secret to why it lasted for centuries. So I'll leave you with a final question to think about. If you had to design a system to rule, which of these pillars would you rely on the most? Would you go for the untouchable authority that comes from divine right, the stability of a clear line of succession, or the down-to-earth effectiveness of a powerful administration? It's a question rulers have been wrestling with for thousands of years. Thanks for joining me.